actually on. Oh.
Right.
Hello, everyone. My name is John Sabatini, and I'd like to welcome you from Memphis, Tennessee. I hope you can hear me clearly. Jean-Baptiste, who helped set this up for me, is monitoring the situation, and he can contact me and let me know if there's any technical problems as we go along. So you can get to him by putting your comments in the live chat. I am about to start up a PowerPoint presentation. A little bit of background. When this was being set up by Jean-Baptiste, he said, well, there's up to, I think, a 45-minute or hour webinar. We went back and forth several times about how to set this up. And so he said, well, you should write a little blurb, and I did. And then it became clear to me, not through any fault of his at all, that he only wanted me to talk for 10 or 15 minutes. Now, I'm a professor, so I've really, in presentations, I usually barely get warmed up in 15 minutes. But I've tried to do that. So I'm going to try to keep this to about 15 minutes of talking in my slides. And then we're going to move into question, answer, and discussion. So I'm starting up the slides, and I hope that you're able to see them. I know there's a very slight lag. And the topic for today is reading assessment across ages and grades. I'm, as the slide says, at the Institute for Intelligent Systems at the University of Memphis. And I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of my background so you understand sort of the perspective I'm taking here today. So I started my sort of research career, and I've always been a researcher, at the National Center on Adult Literacy at the University of Pennsylvania. So I started my reading studies. Now, I studied children, but basically applied this to adults who do not have not acquired proficiency in reading. I then spent the past 17 years or so in the Research and Development Division at Educational Testing Service. Now, through that time, I've mostly done grants and research in reading, but also in assessment. Hence why I am talking to you today about assessment. And I've only been here at Memphis for the past year or so, very much enjoying it. The IIS is basically a very interdisciplinary research group, a lot of technology-based solutions, a lot of ed tech. So I'll bring that up later in the presentation. So my career path has sort of followed a sort of Benjamin Button style. So as I said, I started working in adult literacy education. I threw a lot of acronyms at you because I'm trying to be quick. The NAAL, N-A-A-L, is the National Assessment of Adult Literacy. The PIAC is the international version of adult literacy. And I've been both on literacy panels and designed reading component assessments for those. We also did a intervention study with adults that had very less than 8th grade, 7th grade reading ability to see if we could improve their reading using techniques adapted from those used effectively with children. Then my career path sort of started working its way back down the developmental spectrum to adolescence. And part of that was with Haskins, or researchers from Haskins Laboratories, in a learning disability center that focused on the middle grades, grades 4 through 8. I had grants from the Department of Education, the Institute for Educational Science, IES, that looked at developing assessments for readers who were lagging in their basic foundational skills. I've worked on the international 15-year-old assessment called PISA. And then we've also done some technology-based work to develop learning and assessment online tools for English language learners in the late elementary to middle grades and even in high school. Then I was fortunate to be one of the principal investigators in a very, very large Department of Education project that included 6 different kind of center teams working over 5 years across grades pre-K through 12. And the 5 other teams took bands of about 4 or 5 grades at a time and did reading interventions and reading studies. And our team had to develop assessments across pre-K through 12. And that was a 5-year project, took about 7 years, and it's called the Reading for Understanding Initiative. And that's why I was bringing in this perspective of reading across ages and grades, because that project really forced us to look at the entire developmental spectrum of reading. And most recently, I'm finally, in a weird way, moving all the way down to the early grade levels more aggressively. So I've just been working with the National Assessment of Educational Progress on a special study of 4th grade oral reading fluency. And of course, with Haskins Laboratory and University of Connecticut on their project from the National Science Foundation. So I did promise something about conceptions and misconceptions, and I'm going to try to do this very generally and very quickly. I think the first thing I'd want to say about educational measurement is it's always probabilistic. It doesn't matter if they give you a specific score. The specific score always is maybe, or it could be there, or likely there. But remember, educational learning to read is, I'm going to say, at least 12 years of changing development and learning, and I would argue maybe even lifelong. So any point you pick to measure somebody is a point in that development. And so things are going to change again later, even if you were very precise about what you measured. So I want to sort of make the case, be patient if you're a teacher with parents and others when you are with the students in terms of the precision of that measure, because it can change. You want it to change as a educator, and its precision isn't always perfect. So be ready to sort of understand this as part of a continuum. How do you increase the certainty and precision? Well, you test again and again, or you test different ways of testing the same thing. So that's the whole notion of reliability. It's that because we know we're not testing everything perfectly each time, we test it again, or we test it with different items, or we test it in different ways. And each time you do more and more of that, this is just general measurement in life, you get more precise, more confidence in the measure you have. So I don't want to send the message that all measurements, just don't trust it. I want to send the message that, you know, there's a trade-off between allowing more measurement and getting more precise confidence. If you measure quickly, but you're very off, then you might as well not have measured at all, because you're not going to be confident in your result. The next concept I want to hit is just validity, which is you should always be aiming to measure what you care about. I have a quick little story for this. It's an old joke I've heard that I enjoy. It's the guy's walking outside and he sees another person under a street lamp looking for his keys. So being a good Samaritan, he walks over and he says, can I help? What happened? And the person says, well, I lost my keys. And he says, okay, where do you think you lost them? He says, well, over there by the bushes. And he says, well, why are you looking here? And he goes, well, the light's better. Often in educational measurement, we measure what we know how to measure. And that's not always what we necessarily care about. And we have to make sure to be very careful about thinking through the relationship between what we're measuring and what we care about and the decisions we want to make about it. So that's going to bring me, I'm not moving fast enough, folks, but I will keep it moving, to the idea, and these slides will be made available to you later, so please, take advantage of that to spend a little more time or ask me questions later. So basically, the purpose of this slide is to be clear about what I just said. You have different purposes for measuring things. You may or may not use the same tests or instruments to do that. But think very carefully and closely about when you measure, what decision you want to make, and whether that decision is aimed at that purpose. Because sometimes the instruments are made for general purposes, and you treat them as if they're precise for the particular purpose you have. And you have to be very careful about aligning those up. And so it's very different to say this test measures reliably over the whole range of ability when what you care about is identifying somebody near the bottom as distinctly different and needing, say, an intervention or a special treatment. So, which is very different from saying I have a whole class of students and I wanted to make a decision about whether I think most of them got what I just taught, if you're a teacher, or whether they mastered what I just taught, which is they're ready to move on because I know they actually know this well enough so that they can benefit from the next part of instruction. So this is, again, probably talking to you in generalities, but this is really critical after years of working on this, the challenge of actually understanding what this, what's the decision framework for this test, and not being thrown off by just a general score. Okay. This is where I start the quick discussion about the distinction between what I'm going to call reading components and outcomes or achievement measures. And this is a sort of Hollis Scarborough, great colleague for years ago. I hope she doesn't get mad that I'm using this. Basically showed how their different components go into your development of reading over time. And so I've sort of classified it out to saying, well, when you're first starting, everything's kind of separated. That's the development period. As you start to get to an achieving level, you start to see these come together and be integrated. And eventually they become so tightly woven that you don't even think anymore that you're using sub-skills. They become automatized. They become not available to your conscious attention. So I can tell you that the science tells me that you are doing a lot of computation every time you look at a text on every single word. And a lot of machinery is going into that recognition process and that decoding process as an adult skilled reader. To you, you're reading for meaning. This is important because of when students do not integrate, achieve, and get skills. That we need to work our way backwards diagnostically to say, okay, where did this fail to entwine? What are the things that we might be able to improve or work on to bring them back to this level of achievement? This is just yet another way of showing that the various skills that go into language and reading have different sort of typical developmental trajectories that span all the way to grade 20. By the way, I think I stole this one also from Hollis Scarborough. It was so old in my thing that I'm not even sure where it came from. But this is typical. So there may be individuals who lag in any one of these on this particular scale. And that lagging means things aren't going to necessarily come together in exactly the same way. But notice at the bottom there, text comprehension. It's the slowest, longest line. I think this is a very accurate inference about that particular skill, because that's the one where everything has to come together and work in sort of concert. And it changes and develops differently over time. This is another way to look, again, I know we're talking about assessment, it's another way to look at sort of this idea that you would go from a sort of, actually I'm gonna skip this one, and if you wanna ask me a question about it later, I'll take it up then. Okay, I'm gonna close on just a couple other pieces. I mentioned this Reading for Understanding project, and basically in it we designed two sets of reading assessments. One of them focused on what I'm gonna call reading components, and it was designed particularly because there's an assumption that by 3rd or 4th grade, a lot of the foundational skills have developed well in most all students, and then they should just be focused on comprehension. all the science and all the research that I've ever done, and a lot of colleagues, tells us, no, that's just not, unfortunately, true. Many, many students are still developing those foundational skills. Because they're lagging, text is getting more difficult, more challenging, and they're just unfortunately going to continue to fall behind. So we built batteries that would look at the same kinds of skills we expect to develop as foundational in the early grades, but are sensitive to this development and this lag so that you can see if they're keeping up with the changes in text and comprehension. This particular battery, you can look at the important thing is the skill sets that you look at. So other batteries, other measures can measure these. We built one while I was at ETS that's now available. You can see up in the right-hand corner through that website called CAPD, which does some other services as well that I think are very good. But we've measured these foundational reading skills to see if they're progressing, not just through grade 3, but through grades 4 or 5, all the way up to 10 or so, to see if your comprehension was perhaps being held back by your inability to do efficiently a lot of the skills that support it. And again, I worked originally in adult literacy education, and I saw these skills were lacking all the time. And in fact, I'm working right now on a research project to make them available for adult literacy learners. The last piece I'm going to talk about real quickly is scenario-based assessment. And my PowerPoint just fell off. Sorry, it crashed. And so I'll say it, and then I'll just move on. And then if you ask me questions about it, I will discuss it. Basically, scenario-based assessment says, why are we giving students single passages on random subjects and single questions about them? It's an old model of skill-based learning. It's good. It gives you a sense of reading development. But reading in the 21st century is a lot more involved, complicated, problem solving. There are lots of multiple source activities one has to do. One has to navigate the web. One has to solve problems with text. One has to check the credibility of one's sources. So to keep up with this new kind of world, we built what we call scenario-based assessments. You give the student a purpose for reading materials. You have them go through a series of thematically related content. You have them working with simulated peers and a teacher that guides them through relevance and different kinds of activities with them. And eventually they try to achieve their purpose using text to solve those problems. And that's our assessment technique. So I'm going to end there. Oh, I do have one other piece I would like to show you if I can get my presentation started again, the conclusions, and then I would like to end. So this is what a scenario-based assessment might look like in some of the prototypes that we built. As you can see, there's sort of a larger problem. They're a little bit more graphically interesting, but the important thing is that we cover a lot of different kinds of 21st century reading skills and problems aligned well with the empirical science, the learning science on developing readers at different ages and grade levels. So the big takeaways for my little talk here was reading development is lifelong. Don't think of it as you're done at 4th grade, you're done at 8th grade. Every phase of your life requires new thinking about new development of reading. Disciplinary reading, college reading, each of these requires new sets of skills and new development. If we all keep that in mind, maybe we'll not worry about this moment as much as this moment leading to the next. reading skill has wholes and parts. The wholes are the kind of comprehension, what I said, the scenarios. But if you're breaking down on some of those, you have to look at the parts and see if they've developed properly too. And so assessment can help you to sort of identify both the small and the large. Whenever you use assessment, you don't use the same assessment for everybody in every condition. You, over time, adapt which assessments are used for which purposes, for which students, that are tailored to the need. This idea of giving everybody the same assessment, to me, maybe once, but after that, I think it can all be adapted. And then, learning and assessment can coexist peacefully and in harmony, as opposed to one being opposed to the other, or taking time away from each other. So the last little point I want to bring up is about the future and some ideas we might discuss. And I would love if you asked me about ed technology. And there's a lot of development going on in speech recognition, in natural language processing, which is the way that you linguistically look at the text content. And that's helping us to understand a lot about reading and about developing reading. Of course, artificial intelligence and machine learning is starting to make its way into all the learning materials and assessments we build. And the whole notion of assessment no longer being a separate activity, but really being integrated and embedded in the learning environment. That seems to be coming to us very quickly. You can see these other discussion points. I'll leave those up there if we want to discuss those. And at this point, I'm going to end the slide program and then see if there's any questions or discussion we might have. And I'll put these back up on my screen here. Okay. So I'm looking at the private chat to see some of the questions we have. And one of them is, what do you think of traditional reading comprehension tests used in many schools? So what I think about them is, if they're of the design where it's a passage, random question, random question, random question, passage, different subject, random question, random question, random question. The science of having built those over time means that they are very correlated with overall ability. So if you were to use that measure and you use others, you'd see that there's a relationship between that and skill. It, to me, does not capture a lot of the sets of skills and a lot of activities that one does in the 21st century when one is looking at web-based materials, when one's trying to solve problems with text. And consequently, it underrepresents the problems and the skills that students need. I worry that they're also sort of have a motivational or a negative motivational aspect to them, because those who are accustomed to doing well on them actually prefer them, because then they don't have to learn a new way to be assessed. But those who have failed at them before tend to view them very negatively. And I think that could depress their performance. So I think there are better ways. I think we should be asking and demanding better ways to do assessment of comprehension. Let's see, what else do we have here? Tell us more about how to use reading component batteries in the upper grades. So as I sort of pointed out, most of my career has been spent looking at readers who failed to achieve proficiency. And the problem with the traditional test paradigm is it'll say, well, they didn't get main ideas or draw a conclusion. Well, that's true. The question is that the cause of the problem, or is the cause of the problem they couldn't decode the words on the page accurately? Because they couldn't decode them, they really never built up a adequate vocabulary, a reading vocabulary to sustain their ability to do comprehension, and therefore they spent all their energy making inferences just to figure out what was going on and didn't have enough left over to do higher order processing. So the goal of the reading components is to say, maybe we can rule out some of those lower problems. I mean, that was its first premise. If we can say, oh, well, they decode fine, they're able to handle new multisyllabic words that they're going to encounter in their curriculum and acquire them easily. They're able to recognize a lot of these words and their meanings. They understand the morphology of the language, the derivational, so they can generate new meanings of words once they understand the root and how these work. Things like this. These all help you to get a profile of that student. And there are aligned practice techniques, interventions, ways to put their attention on these sub-skills, even as they learn content in their classrooms, in their subject area classrooms. So that's how I see them benefiting the entire process, because the alternate that I see is individuals who, because reading is effortful at each time, because these foundational skills have not become automatized and transparent, that reading is always an effort. Therefore, they avoid reading, and then you get a vicious cycle of not developing your reading skills. And so I think a little bit of focus and attention on them. The older the learners, the more metacognitively aware they are, the more you can bring them into this process, the more that will help them to become, to recognize themselves as highly skilled readers and to continue that development lifelong. So what do I think of progress monitoring measures like AIMSweb or DIBBLES? Used for their purposes, they're built on a premise that I think is very sound. The response to intervention model says, because reading needs to be taught, if you didn't get the opportunities, instructional opportunities to read well, those may be a cause of your not reading well. If you start to fall behind the curriculum, we need to give you more attention, and that attention should be focused on your needs. So I think the whole enterprise of those tools was built on this idea that you should watch to see if people are responding to what instruction is in front of them, and if they're keeping up, then you keep going. You don't need to be deeply diagnostic if you're keeping up with the curriculum and you're mastering things as you go along. But as you start to fall behind, things get very, very tangled. And it's not okay to just keep going and running ahead of people who are slowing down in their development of different skills. Because as you go across the grades, the texts themselves are getting more complicated. The questions we're asking people of the texts are getting more complicated. The vocabularies are growing. So you can't fall behind and catch up easily because text processing is accelerating away from you in a certain way. And you need to be able to keep up. So I think there's a benefit to them. I think that they're used maybe too forcefully, maybe too often, maybe not always with the kind of thoughtfulness that they need to have. And I think we can all have a longer discussion about how best to use those to guide good instructional decision making and not find them to be just something that interferes with that process. What is the role of oral reading fluency in assessment and reading development? The thing about reading, for the most part, skilled reading is it's silent and invisible. So all these things are going on inside your head, and you can't see the evidence of them except through the way students respond or answer questions or other things. I think that oral reading and oral reading fluency is one of the sort of best evidence sources for the continued development of those sort of foundational skills. That the evidence we see is that there continue to be correlated with comprehension. The theoretical mechanisms by which that works make a lot of sense, because if you are turning printed text very quickly into language, then you can process it as language in terms of your thinking, problem solving, other kinds of operations. And so the ability to move it from printed text into speech with expression, which means that you've imposed some thinking on the structure of it and the meaning of it, is a very good evidence source for making inferences about that development. So I encourage both oral reading fluency development as long as it takes. There's no cutoff point. I mean, again, as you get older, you get more complicated texts. You have to spend, you have to learn to read them fluently for understanding. So I think it's a very powerful tool in assessment. In terms of technology, the speech recognition capabilities are now really developed to the point where you can get accurate and precise scores. And I know some projects that are working on profiles. Group I work with called AMI, Moby Read, is one of those tools. They're the ones who developed, I should mention that the NAEP oral reading fluency study was done completely on an iPad. So the student would see things on the iPad. It actually talked them through how to respond. They read out loud into it. Speech technology scored the responses, and those were validated and verified against humans. So I think we're moving into an age where patient devices listening to you read is a real reality, both in instruction and in assessment. Let's see. Is reading on a computer or in a book different? Does it require specific skills? It is. I was slow to come to the differences between digital reading and book reading, or offline reading. And again, we're talking about a couple different things. The most dramatic way of pointing this out is that in 1997 or so, when I was still finishing my graduate work, there was about 1.2 million websites. In 2007, I think it's 120 million websites. By 2017, 1.2 billion websites. I mean, it's literally exponential growth. You can't attack the internet like you would a book, sitting down and just reading straight through. You have to do a lot more pre-processing, making decisions about what's important, what's relevant, how to find it, how to avoid the distraction of all the ads, et cetera, et cetera. There are just many, many different skills. And those of us who have sort of adapted from a print literacy world to this digital world, we're able to move some of those skills and keep up with it. But I think there's just a whole, we shouldn't rely on that into the future. We have to be thinking differently about reading given this context. So there are other changes going on, and it's all of us in the world of research are trying to figure out how to keep up with it all. So that's at least some kind of an answer. Just yes, monitor that, please research and think about it. And if you're an educator, think about it in your instruction. Of course, if you're a parent, you're thinking about that all the time. what do you see as promising ed tech innovations in reading assessment? Well, I'm an advocate of kind of the statement that, you know, literacy is digital. I mean, yes, it coexists with print, but as I just pointed out, overwhelmingly, the commerce we do, the business we do, the interactions with text, the acquisition of information are happening in a digital environment. And so do assessments. And there's great benefit to the world, the technical world of assessment, because many of the existing assessments that's hard to shake out of our heads, like these comprehension tests, were the most efficient technology of their day. I mean, the reason that a lot of comprehension tests look the way they do is because it was expensive to publish print and then mail it around to different places. So they came up with techniques to condense it and make it objective through multiple choice scoring and reusable. But all those constraints I just mentioned are gone. So the designs that were optimized for that world need to go to. And so we can do things differently. We can use the speech capabilities. And, you know, again, the computer scientists, the colleagues I have, they've taken the best of how humans learn, and sometimes they get the machines to learn in very similar ways. And the machine learning can facilitate this whole process. There are also risks involved with that, but that's part of this brave new world we're still working on together to figure out what's the best ways to facilitate education and what are some of the ways that the risks that we want to avoid in that kind of machine learning and AI development. I think that appears to be all the questions. Are there any others that questions that anyone has to request? If not, I want to thank you all for tuning in, if you did. And my understanding is that this will be made available after the fact for those interested in viewing it. And if you are interested in maybe more web links or resources, please contact the moderator, Jean-Baptiste, and he'll get to me, and I'll make sure that they are accessible and available to you. So